There are certain moments that don't feel important when they happen. Small moments, the kind you brush off because making something of them feels ungrateful or dramatic or unkind to people who are only trying to help. I had dozens of those moments in the months I spent in my son's house outside Boston. And then one Sunday evening, I came downstairs and saw 4 plates instead of 5, and something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying finally broke open inside me. My name is Margaret. I am 81 years old, and it took a missing plate for me to understand what had been quietly disappearing for months. My husband Robert and I were married for 53 years. We met at a church social in 1968 when I was 22 years old and he was wearing a tie that was slightly too short and smiling at the wrong moments during the hymns, which made me like him immediately. We grew up together in the way that married couples do when the marriage is long enough, through children, through illness, through the ordinary accumulated weight of a shared life that keeps getting heavier and more valuable at the same time. When he died, the silence that moved into our house was unlike any I had ever known. Not peaceful, not restful, not the good kind of quiet that settles over a room in the evening. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that sits in the other chair at dinner and rides in the passenger seat on the way to the grocery store, and stands beside you in the kitchen at 7 in the morning when you realize you've made 2 cups of coffee out of pure muscle memory. My son David said I shouldn't be alone anymore. His wife Christine said I would always have a place with them. I believed them both, because I wanted to believe them and because I needed to believe something. I arrived with 2 suitcases, a box of old photographs, and the quiet determination not to become a burden to anyone. I had carried that determination all my life. The idea that self-sufficiency was a form of love, that not needing things from people was a way of protecting them. It was the first mistake I made in that house. It would not be the last. I spent the early weeks trying to earn my place. I folded laundry before anyone asked, every piece, and put it away in the right drawers. I sat at the kitchen counter and peeled potatoes while Christine cooked, because having something useful to do with my hands made me feel less like a guest. I watched my youngest grandson after school, even on the days when my back ached badly, because I told myself that was why I was there, to be helpful, to contribute, to be easy. I told myself I was lucky to hear family noise filling a house again, instead of the silence waiting back in my old house on Elm Street. I told myself a lot of things in those early weeks that I would have been better off not believing. If you've ever felt yourself slowly disappearing in a house full of people who love you, subscribe to this channel. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. You may not be as alone as you think. Things changed so gradually that I kept finding reasons to explain them away. Dinner conversations were faster, spilling over with school schedules and work deadlines and plans I wasn't part of and wasn't asked to be part of. Some evenings David and Christine ate early because the kids were starving, which made sense, of course it made sense. Other nights they ordered food in without asking what I wanted, which also made sense because no one wanted to make a fuss over nothing. When I started to tell a story, someone usually remembered something urgent before I reached the end. That also made sense. Everyone was busy. I was the one with time, and I should have been grateful. I became very good at explaining things away. It was a skill I had refined over decades of raising children and keeping peace in difficult rooms, and being the kind of woman who smoothed things over before anyone else noticed there was something to smooth. I explained the interrupted stories, and the early dinners, and the food ordered without asking, and the outings I wasn't invited to join. I explained them to myself with such fluency and such generosity toward everyone involved that I stopped noticing what I was actually being asked to accept. What I was quietly being trained to believe about my own place in that household. Then came that Sunday evening. My knees were aching, worse than usual, and I came downstairs a little later than I normally would have. I stopped in the doorway of the dining room. I counted the plates without meaning to. It's the kind of thing you notice when you've set enough tables in your life to do it automatically. 4 plates, 5 people in the house. Christine looked up and had the expression of someone who has been caught doing something she knows isn't quite right. She adjusted it into a gentle smile almost immediately. "We thought you might want to eat upstairs tonight," she said. "It's quieter for you up there." Nobody was cruel. That was what broke me open, finally and quietly, standing there in the doorway with my hand on the frame. Not cruelty, the absence of it. Because cruelty at least carries in it the acknowledgement that someone is there to be cruel too. It means you still register. Cruelty is a kind of rough attention. What I encountered in that doorway was something different and far harder to put a name to. I was being accommodated. I was being managed. I had become a practical consideration, something to be thoughtfully, kindly arranged around. The way you rearrange furniture in a room to make the space function better for the people who use it most. The furniture doesn't have feelings about the rearrangement. The furniture is simply moved. Have you ever felt that? Not disliked, not unwanted, but somehow edited out of a life you used to belong to? Tell me honestly. I carried my own plate upstairs that night, with hands that were shaking more than usual. I sat in the small guest room that used to be called the office, and would apparently be called the office again some day. I could hear laughter drifting up from the dining room below me. Real laughter, warm laughter, the ordinary laughter of a family at dinner. And sitting there alone in that room, listening to it drift through the floor, I felt something come clear inside me that had been blurred for months. I had been mistaking tolerance for love. I had been calling patience what was actually distance. I had been counting the small courtesies as belonging, and belonging had quietly left the house some time ago without anyone noticing, including me. In the days after that evening, I began noticing things I had trained myself not to see. Family outings were planned without anyone asking if I'd like to come. My room was casually referred to as the office in conversations where people forgot I was within earshot. David discussed my medical appointments with Christine while I sat right beside him at the kitchen table, as though I were a topic on the agenda rather than the person the agenda was about. None of it was done with malice. Every piece of it was done with the efficient, well-meaning practicality of people managing more than they could comfortably hold. One afternoon, I was resting in the sitting room with a book open on my lap. They thought I was napping, which was an assumption people made about me with increasing frequency the longer I lived there. I heard David and Christine in the kitchen, their voices low, but not low enough. They were talking about assisted living communities in the area. Christine mentioned one she'd looked up online, described the dining room and the activities calendar and the staff ratio. David asked about the cost. Christine said she'd already requested a brochure. They both spoke quietly, reasonably, the way adults speak when they're discussing something difficult and trying to be responsible about it. Christine's voice sounded tired, not the ordinary tired of a busy week, but the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying something indefinitely without being able to see where it ends. David's voice carried guilt that he was doing his best to contain. Neither of them sounded unkind. Neither of them sounded like they wished me harm. They sounded exactly like two good people navigating something they hadn't fully prepared for, trying to find a solution that would be workable for everyone. They sounded like people rearranging their lives around something they no longer quite knew how to carry. That hurt more than any cruelty would have, because cruelty requires a villain, and this had none. There was nothing to be angry at, nothing to push back against, nothing that would hold still long enough to be named and confronted. Just two people in a kitchen, doing their quiet, loving, exhausted best. For several days I said very little. I went through the motions of each day. Breakfast at the kitchen table, the folding of laundry that no one had asked me to fold, the afternoons sitting in the chair by the window that had gradually become understood as my chair, dinner wherever they set a place, which was sometimes at the table and sometimes upstairs on a tray with a small glass of juice that Christine brought up with genuine kindness and a smile that was also genuine. I received all of it. I said thank you for all of it. And beneath the thank yous, beneath the going through of motions, something had begun moving inside me that was entirely different in quality from anything I had felt since the day I'd arrived. It wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that, because what I felt didn't have anger's heat or anger's urgency. It was something quieter and more deliberate, something that had been waiting for the right conditions to surface. The way a very deep feeling sometimes needs to be pressed all the way down before it can finally come up. For the first time since I had moved into that house, I stopped organising my thoughts around the question of how to be easier to live with. I started, slowly and tentatively, asking myself a different question entirely. What did I still want? Not what could I reasonably expect, not what was sensible given my age and my health and my circumstances, but what did I actually want from whatever days I still had coming to me? I called Eleanor, an old friend from the church I'd belonged to in Somerville for 30 years. We hadn't spoken properly in almost a year. The move to David's house had disrupted most of my old routines, and I'd let them fall away without quite meaning to. When I called, she answered on the second ring and said immediately that she was so glad I'd phoned, that she'd been thinking about me. We met for coffee at a diner near her apartment in Watertown, a place with red vinyl booths and coffee that came without being asked. We sat there for nearly 2 hours. We talked about her garden, which she was replanting in spite of her bad hip and the strong opinions of her daughter, who thought she should leave the heavy work alone. We talked about the book she was in the middle of and whether the ending was going to be worth it. We talked about the trip she was still half seriously considering to visit her sister out in Nova Scotia, which she'd been considering for 3 years and which might or might not actually happen, and the uncertainty of it didn't seem to bother either of us. We talked about nothing that had anything to do with health management or family logistics, or the particular kind of fatigue that comes from living in someone else's home on someone else's terms. I drove myself there and back. When I returned, nobody asked where I'd been. I didn't explain. That silence, the ordinary, unremarkable silence of a woman coming back from her afternoon, felt like something I'd reclaimed. I began taking short walks alone again, in spite of the worried expressions and the gentle warnings that I really ought to have someone with me. I let the worry exist and took the walks anyway. One afternoon I visited a senior apartment community about 1.5 miles from David's house. Clean, calm, quietly busy with people who moved at their own pace and made their own choices about meals and visitors and what time they turned their lights off at night. I walked through the common room and sat for a while in the garden and picked up a brochure. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was scheming, not because I was trying to punish anyone, because I was beginning to understand something that should have been obvious all along. A life that belongs to you has to start with choices that belong to you, even small ones, especially small ones. When I finally told David I was planning to move out, I chose an ordinary Tuesday morning after breakfast. No particular occasion. I just said it. He went through several emotions quickly, in the way that people do when they're surprised by something they probably should have seen coming. Shock first, genuine shock, the wide-open kind. Then a hurt that shifted, as I watched, into something closer to anger, or maybe defensive disbelief. He told me they had given up so much to bring me into their home, that they had adjusted everything, that Christine had changed her whole schedule, that he worried about me constantly. All of this was probably true. I didn't argue with any of it. I waited until he had finished, and then I said the only thing I had needed to say since the evening I sat upstairs with my plate, listening to laughter come through the floor. You stopped making space for me long before I decided to leave. The silence that followed was different from every other silence in that house. Not the silence of a room that empties out in the evening. Not the silence of a guest room at the end of a hallway. This was the silence of something true that had been said and that no one could immediately answer. Because it didn't have an answer that could be given in the next few seconds. David looked at me. I looked back. After a while, he looked away. A few months later, I was living in a small apartment in Cambridge. Floral curtains I chose myself, second-hand furniture I arranged myself. A kitchen window that looked out onto the street where people walked with dogs in the mornings. There was a balcony barely large enough for 2 chairs, which meant I could invite someone or I could sit there alone, and both of those things were equally possible and equally my choice. The apartment wasn't impressive. It smelled like fresh paint for the first 2 weeks, and the radiators knocked in the cold. But it was mine, in a way that David's guest room at the end of the hallway never was, and never could have been. My hands still shook sometimes when I poured tea. Loneliness still came through the door on certain evenings. especially in November, when the light left early and the rooms felt smaller, and I hadn't yet had time to fill them with enough of my own accumulated presence to make them feel fully inhabited. I hadn't fixed loneliness. I hadn't solved old age. I hadn't discovered some secret way to make the last chapter easy. I had done exactly one quiet, deliberate thing, and I had done it entirely for myself. Every evening, I set the table. Just for one, usually. One plate, one glass, one set of silverware laid out properly, the way my mother had always insisted silverware should be laid out, because even one person eating alone deserved a properly set table. Every single night, there was a plate there waiting for me. Not a kindness extended by someone else's household, not an arrangement made on my behalf by people who cared but weren't sure what else to do. My plate, on my table, in my own small life, which still had something left in it worth setting a table for. Tell me, when the people who love you stop making room for you at the table, how do you find your way back to your own life?